So for my final project, I decided to do the ethical dilemma of informed consent. And just to give a little background information, the ethical dilemma surrounding informed consent is a legacy of research in which individuals who were experimented on or had something taken from them during a procedure without their current consent or were not informed of what was going to be done to them in cases such as the syphilis in Guatemala and how the prison inmates were infected, and in multiple other cases like the Tuskegee trials. Uh, and just to give a little background information on that, from a reading on week 2 from Glenn, it says the use of such persons for research has led to a biomedical corpus of knowledge that has been detached from a greater understanding of humans as primarily social symbolic rather than purely biological beings. Um, so even though this research has given us a multitude of answers and solutions to current diseases and problems, it was done so without the consent of the individuals who were tested on and were marginalized by this treatment. And it was mostly done on minority groups such as Latinx communities, Black communities, and just communities of minorities in general, and such as Native Americans as well. So creates these disparities within these communities, and it builds this mistrust between these communities and the medical professionals who are trying to provide them with treatment. But there is that gap in that trust, and this is the dilemma of informed consent. So another background from another reading from week 7. It says from New York Times, from 1946 to 1948, American public health doctors infected nearly 700 Guatemalan prison inmates, mental patients, and soldiers with venereal diseases in what was meant as an effort to test the effectiveness of penicillin. So even though we did derive a response to these diseases, it was done so at the well-being and the lack of consent given from these inmates, and they were treated kind of as like lab rats, which is something that is completely wrong and creates this issue that we see today from that legacy of informed consent and the ethical dilemma surrounding it. So this plays into the Henrietta Lacks HeLa cells, where she went to the John Hopkins Hospital for cervical cancer. But during the procedure, they removed a section of tissue from the cervical or from the cervix, and which was then realized as immortal cells that were forever reproduced and is used as current research today for answers to current diseases and outbreaks that might happen. So it was very beneficial, but done so at the lack of consent given by Henrietta, and it was taken from her without her knowledge for a procedure of cancer. So that was also another thing that I used within my project was this blog clip that I took from this website. So the law offices of James L. Arrowsmith. I use this to kind of give a visual representation, and also an informed representation of the legacy of the ethical dilemma of informed consent, which would also tie into my next one, which is also another blog / news clip. It's an editorial from the New York Times, and it's the reckoning with UCSF's dark history of unethical medical experiments on inmates. So for this one, back in the 1960s, 1970s, there was 2,600 state prisoners that were used as dermatological, basically test subjects without their knowledge, where they would apply like pesticide and other like horrible things directly to their skin, which could cause bad reactions and even cancer risk. So this was done so against their will, and without their knowledge of what was being done to them, which is a huge issue, and it shows that the ethical dilemma surrounding informed consent even happened in like recent history. And it's still something that plays a major role into the medical research and experimentation that is done today. Another thing I decided to use was a little cartoon graphic that represents the issue of informed consent, where shows just a long list of explanations of things that will be done to the patient, but it's done so at kind of like to mislead the patient in a sense, since no one is really going to read through all of that, and they kind of just tell them like, oh, this is basically what it means. Just sign here. You don't have to read the whole thing. I'm sure you've heard a lot of doctors say that, to where, oh, basically just saying this, and that, just sign. But there's a lot more that goes into depth on what was going to be done and what they're going to do and what may happen, the risks and all that with the surgery or with the experimentation. So it's important to read everything, but some people are not given the opportunity to understand the knowledge or understand the vocabulary used. So vocabulary is also something that misleads the patients, where they may not understand what is truly being said. And especially within non-English speakers, there is a lot more translators available for the non-English speakers. But back in recent history, few were provided, and most of them did not translate well. And there's still that lack of understanding of what was going to be done. And that still arises an issue of informed consent and ethical dilemma surrounding it. So they also decided to do some recent history, which was COVID-19. It was another editorial / blog clip from National Institute of Health. So they were discussing how certain data and results were being lied about to the patients in order to basically keep them from going out. So even if the patient didn't experience any of the symptoms and tested negative for COVID-19, they were still told that they had the symptoms and still told they have COVID-19 in order to reduce the risk of spreading the disease as a measure of controlling the outbreak risk. Yes, people should be aware of the outbreak and like the risk of it, and should wear masks and take procedures to reduce that. But at the same time, there should be transparency in what they actually have and what they can actually do and the parameters surrounding it, which shows that the issue of informed consent still happens today. There's still a rising issue within certain fields, and it's something that should be looked into further. I also decided to use a synthetic embryo raises ethical issues news clip. For this one, there's an issue of informed consent because they were creating basically lab babies. So they're using synthetic embryos with sperm cells to create children within a lab for IVF patients, and then putting it inside the womb of the patient that cannot bear children naturally, just due to certain health complications and risks. The issue surrounding this is that they're doing so without the consent of the donor, or without the consent of maybe even the patient knowing that this is a synthetic embryo. So there's that still, and this is happening even in 2023, and it's still a current issue today. But and all the ethical dilemma of informed consent, there's been horrible past history from the beginning of it, where they're doing these mass tests on prison inmates and even certain populations and communities in order to derive results regarding a certain medication, or basically just medication and other treatments that they may derive from these experiments, and how it plays a role into today, how there's still an ethical dilemma of informed consent on certain procedures and what is going to be done to the patient today. Thank you.